The morning Mamie Slater found out her husband was dead, the sky over the Texas Panhandle turned the color of a bruise, purple and greenish and wrong in every direction. And she stood on the porch of the Double W Ranch holding a telegram in both hands while the cattle bawled in the distance as if they already knew. It was the autumn of 1878, and James Slater had been gone for 8 months, riding south to settle a land dispute with his brother in San Antonio, when fever took him along the road outside of Laredo. A traveling preacher had sent the telegram. He'd written that James went peaceful, which Mamie did not believe, because James had never done anything peaceful in his entire 34 years of living. He had been a man made of motion and noise, of boot heels on plank floors and laughter that rattled window glass, and the idea of him lying still somewhere in the dust of South Texas, while she stood here on their porch with a telegram in her hands, seemed like the cruelest joke the world had ever told. She was 29 years old. She had a ranch of 1,100 acres in the rolling grasslands east of Amarillo, a herd of 230 cattle, 4 horses, 2 ranch hands named Pinto Davis and old Ezra Flood, a well that needed new rope, and a cattle brand that had been registered in the name of James Slater in the year 1872, when he'd pressed that double W shape into the flank of his first heifer and declared himself a rancher with such pride that she had laughed until she cried. What she did not have was any idea what she was supposed to do next. She folded the telegram, placed it in the pocket of her apron, and walked off the porch into the gray morning to find Pinto Davis. Pinto was a lean, weathered man of 40-something who had been with James since before Mamie had come into the picture, and he was crouching beside the fence of the near pasture when she found him, mending a post that had leaned over in the last windstorm. He took one look at her face and straightened up slowly, pulling his hat from his head. "He's gone," Mamie said. She didn't cry. She had already decided, somewhere in the walk from the porch to the pasture, that crying was a thing she would save for the night, when no one needed her to be anything in particular. Pinto held his hat over his heart. "Lord have mercy," he said quietly. Then, after a long moment, he put his hat back on. "What do you need me to do?" That question was the first act of grace anyone offered her, and she never forgot it. Not what are you going to do, not how will you manage, not you ought to sell and go back to your people in Missouri. Just, what do you need me to do? She reached out and squeezed his forearm and told him to keep the fence mending going because they had cattle to contain, and she walked back to the house to make a list. The list was how she survived the first year. She made lists of everything. What the cattle needed, what the land needed, what the water situation was, what the debts were. James had left behind a small amount of savings in the Citizens Bank of Amarillo and a considerably larger amount of debt on the land itself, and the interest was due every spring. She did the arithmetic on the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and a scrap of brown paper bag, and the arithmetic told her clearly that she needed to run this ranch properly and profitably, or she was going to lose it within 2 years. She was not going to lose it. The Double W brand was hers now, by widow's right, and she had it re-registered at the county seat in her name in the February of 1879, 4 months after James died. The clerk at the county office, a thin, nervous man named Purdy, had looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that suggested he found her presence unusual and her request irregular. She had looked back at him with an expression that suggested she had no interest whatsoever in his feelings on the matter and would he please complete the paperwork. He completed the paperwork. The Double W brand, 2 overlapping W shapes pressed one inside the other, went on living in the registry of Randall County, Texas, under the name Mamie Slater, widow, of the Double W Ranch. And so the work began. The first full year was the hardest in ways she had not anticipated. The cattle market in Amarillo was running through the hands of a man named Galt Prentice, who had interests in 3 of the 5 largest ranches in the county, and who had a habit of offering widows and small operators less than fair price for their stock on the grounds that they had no one else to sell to. Mamie sold to him once, in the spring of 1879, because she needed the cash. She watched him count out her money with the slow, deliberate care of a man who wanted you to know he was doing you a favor, and she smiled at him pleasantly, and took the money, and drove home with Pinto on the wagon seat beside her, and decided she would find another way. The other way turned out to be a cattle drive. In the summer of 1879, she arranged with two neighboring ranchers, the Havorson brothers who ran the Rocking H to her north, and a quiet Mexican rancher named Señor Bautista who ran his small operation to her west, to pool their cattle and send them together up the trail to Dodge City, Kansas. She contributed 60 head to the combined drive of 180 animals. Pinto went with the drive as her representative, and came back 3 weeks later with significantly more money per head than Galt Prentice had ever offered, and a sunburn that turned his neck the color of a brick. She kept every cent of the profit and paid down a portion of the land debt, and reinvested the rest in 2 young bulls. She bought off a man passing through from New Mexico, good thick-shouldered animals, whose bloodlines she'd inspected, with the careful attention of someone who had been paying close attention to cattle breeding since her husband first started explaining it to her 7 years ago. James had been a talker about cattle. He could explain the merits of different bloodlines the way some men discussed philosophy, with heat and conviction and a kind of joy at the subject. She had absorbed all of it, every word, because she loved him and he was interesting when he talked about the things he cared about, and now she was grateful for every single sentence she had retained. The second year was harder in different ways. Ezra Flood, their older hand, broke his hip in the early winter of 1880 and could no longer do the heavy work. She helped him find a place in town at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, and she paid his first 2 months of rent out of her own pocket because he was 63 years old and had given his better years to this ranch, and she was not going to put him out with nothing. She wrote it in the ledger as an expense and did not regret it. Without Ezra, she and Pinto were short-handed, and she hired on a young man named Tommy Birch who was 17 and desperately eager to prove himself, and a second man named Cord Maddox who was 30 and steady and knew horses better than anyone she had ever met. Between the 4 of them, they managed the herd through the winter of 1880, which was harsh and long and took 14 head of cattle before spring arrived and the grass came back. She grieved those 14 cattle the way another woman might grieve smaller losses. Each one represented money she didn't have and debt that was still on the land. She bought 6 replacement heifers in the spring and kept going. By 1881, the Double W brand was holding steady at 215 head, not growing the way she dreamed of growing it, not prospering the way James had always talked about prospering, but holding. The land debt was down from where it had been. She had her savings in the Citizens Bank back above the level she needed for emergencies. She had learned to read the sky for weather the way the old ranchers could, to feel the change coming in the way the wind shifted over the grass, to know which sections of fence were weakest, and which cattle were most likely to wander toward them. She had also learned to shoot accurately enough that, when a pair of men she didn't know appeared one evening along her western fence line, behaving in ways that suggested they were contemplating whether her cattle might be worth the risk of moving, she had walked out to the fence with her rifle and stood there in the fading light until they reconsidered. Pinto had been 50 yards behind her with his own rifle and had said afterward, riding back to the barn, that he'd never seen a woman hold a line like that, and she'd told him she'd learned from necessity and that it was nothing to remark upon. He'd remarked upon it to everyone he'd talked to in town for the next several months regardless. The people of Amarillo had complicated feelings about Mamie Slater. The women of the town were divided between those who admired her and those who found her unsettling, because she was not behaving the way a widow was supposed to behave, which was to say she was not fading quietly, was not selling out and going back to family, was not remarrying in a practical hurry to put a man back in charge of the Double W. The men of the town were also divided, though their divisions were different. Some of them respected what she was doing. Some of them were waiting for her to fail so they could buy her land cheap. And some, a smaller group, were simply watching her with the kind of quiet attention men give to things they find unexpectedly impressive. She did not pay much attention to any of them. She was busy. The years turned. 1882 brought good rain and a strong calf crop, and she finally showed a profit that felt like something real rather than just survival. She hired a third permanent hand, a quiet Comanche man named Red Horse, who had been working odd jobs around the territory since the reservation years had begun to change his people's way of life, and who turned out to be the best natural horseman she had ever seen, and who had a knowledge of the land and its patterns that complemented her own growing understanding in ways she found invaluable. She paid him the same wage she paid her other hands, which was a decision Galt Prentice heard about and commented upon in the saloon, and which she heard about second-hand and responded to by going about her business exactly as she had before. Red Horse stayed for 3 years, and in that time he taught her things about reading cattle behavior and predicting the weather and moving a herd through rough country that she could never have learned from a book. And when he finally moved on in 1885 to go north to join relatives near the Llano Estacado, she shook his hand and told him he had been a good hand and a good man, and she was grateful for every day of it, and she meant every word. 1883 brought drought and struggle again, and 1884 brought a fence dispute with a neighbor to the east, a newer arrival named Caldwell who had money from back east and ideas about range boundaries that did not align with what James had established years before. The dispute lasted 8 months and involved 2 lawyers and a county surveyor and Mamie standing in a pasture in the August heat pointing at survey stakes with a steadiness that eventually outlasted Caldwell's patience, because he had other investments, and she had nothing but this land and the stamina that comes from having absolutely no alternative. She won the fence dispute. By 1884, she had been running the Double W alone for 6 years. 6 years of lists and ledgers and seasons, and cattle and fence lines and market prices, and the particular grinding loneliness of being a woman entirely responsible for something this large in a time and place where that was not exactly what the world had designed for you. She had her neighbors, the Havorsons and old Senor Bautista and others. She had Pinto and Cord and young Tommy, who was not so young anymore and who had become a genuinely capable cowhand in his years at the Double W. She had the town of Amarillo at a distance, and Mrs. Calloway, who had become a kind of friend, and the letters she wrote every month to her sister in Missouri, who wrote back with news of a life so different from Mamie's own that reading those letters sometimes felt like reading about another world. She had the cattle brand, the Double W pressed into the flanks of more than 240 animals, stamped on fence posts and carved into the wooden sign at the ranch gate and registered in the county records in her name. She had all of this. What she did not have, and had stopped expecting she would ever have again, was anyone to share it with. The morning Charles Warren rode onto the Double W property, the sky was doing that particular Texas thing where it couldn't decide between blue and gold, and had settled on both simultaneously, flooding the grassland with a light that made everything look like it had been cut from something precious. It was late October of 1884, and the air carried the first real bite of coming winter, and Mamie was out by the south pasture fence with Cord Maddox inspecting a section that had taken some damage in last week's windstorm. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A steady, measured canter coming up the main track from the road, not the hurried pace of trouble or the slow drift of a vagrant, but the deliberate movement of someone who knew where he was going and was in no particular hurry about it. She straightened up from the fence and put her hand up against the sun to get a look. The man riding toward her was tall in the saddle in the way of someone born to horses, with a long, easy seat that meant comfort rather than instruction. He was broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with the deeply weathered look of someone who had spent years in hard sun. He wore a gray hat with a low crown and a long brown trail coat that had seen considerable weather, and he rode a dark bay horse that was dusty from the road but clearly a fine animal underneath the dust. He drew up about 20 yards away and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and careful, a voice that had learned to carry across distance without needing to be loud. "This the double W." "It is," she said. "I'm looking for James Slater." The words landed the way those words always landed when they were addressed to her, with a small sharp percussion in the chest that she had never quite gotten used to even after 6 years. "James Slater has been dead for 6 years," she said. "I'm his widow, Mamie Slater." Something moved across the man's face. It was not quite surprise and not quite grief, but something more complicated than either. He sat very still on his horse for a moment, and then he took his hat off and held it at his side. "I'm Charles Warren," he said. "James and I were friends. We rode together for 3 years before he started this ranch. I've been away." He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Slater. And I'm sorry to arrive like this without warning. I didn't know." "How would you have?" she said, and it wasn't a question. She looked at him for another moment, measuring him the way she measured everything these days, with the practical eye of someone who had learned that first impressions were data. He held her gaze without challenge or discomfort. That was something. "Get down off your horse, Mr. Warren. You've been riding. I'll have someone see to your animal and you can come inside and have coffee." He got down. He was taller standing than she'd estimated, a good foot taller than her, with the kind of physical ease that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He shook her hand when she offered it, and his grip was firm and brief and respectful, which were the 3 things she required of a handshake. Cord took the horse, eyeing the stranger with the quiet assessment of a man who had learned over the years that strangers arriving at the Double W were worth watching. Mamie led Charles Warren to the house and poured him coffee and sat across the table from him, and they talked. He had known James before the ranch, he said, back when both of them were young men working the cattle drives up from Texas to Kansas. They had ridden together for 3 seasons, become the kind of close that men become when they have saved each other's lives a couple of times, and spent months in the saddle with nothing to look at but grass and sky. Then James had met Mamie, and James had gotten land fever, and Charles had kept going. He'd gone west. There had been work in New Mexico, then Arizona. Then he'd gotten caught up in some freight hauling that had taken him down into Old Mexico for a stretch. And then he'd been working up in Wyoming territory for the past several years, and it had simply taken this long to make his way back to Texas, and to the name of a man he'd been meaning to visit for going on a decade. He said all of this with a quiet directness that she found she appreciated. He was not performing the story, he was simply telling it. "What brings you back to Texas now?" she asked. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at it for a moment before answering. "I'm 40 years old, Mrs. Slater," he said. "I've been moving since I was 16. There comes a point where a man has to ask himself what he's moving toward." He looked up at her. "James always talked about this place like it was something worth moving toward. I thought I'd come see it." She looked at him steadily. There was something in his face that was hard to read, not closed exactly, but worn in a way that suggested it had been a long road, and he had given a great deal of himself to it and was not entirely sure what he had left. She recognized the look distantly because she had seen something similar in her own mirror on certain mornings. "You're welcome to stay and see it," she said. "I have a bunkhouse with room if you're not in a hurry to be somewhere." He wasn't in a hurry to be somewhere. He stayed. The first week, he stayed out of the way and observed. She noticed this, the way he moved around the operation without inserting himself, learning the lay of the land and the patterns of the work before he said anything about them. On the 4th day, he asked Cord if he could help with the remuda repair that Cord had been working on. And Cord, who was not a man who gave ground easily, said yes. And by the end of the afternoon they were working in an easy rhythm that suggested Charles Warren knew horses about as well as Cord Maddox did, which was very well indeed. On the sixth day, he found Mamie in the barn in the early morning checking over the cattle records she kept in a ledger she'd been maintaining since James died, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before knocking on the doorframe to announce himself, which she appreciated because the barn in the early morning was one of her private times and she would not have liked being startled. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Ask. How many head do you have in the south pasture that are ready to go to market?" She told him. He nodded, looking thoughtful. "And the trail arrangements for the drive, do you still go through the pooling arrangement with the Havorsons?" "We do. We add Senor Bautista's animals as well, though he has fewer than he used to since his two older sons moved north." Charles nodded again. "The price per head in Dodge City last season." She told him that too, and then she looked at him and said, "Why are you asking me these questions, Mr. Warren?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I've been sitting in your bunkhouse for 6 days watching you run a 250-head operation with 3 hands and doing it in a way that would make most ranchers with 5 hands jealous, and I'm trying to understand how you've done it." She was quiet for a long moment. "I've had to," she said simply. "That's not an explanation," he said. "Plenty of people face necessity and still fail." She closed her ledger and looked at him directly. "Then I'll give you a better answer. When James died, I made a decision that I was going to run this ranch the same way he would have wanted it run, which is to say I was going to take his brand and his land and his herd, and I was going to keep them alive. Not because I had to, because it was right. Because he built this thing and it mattered, and I was not going to let it disappear just because he was gone." Charles Warren looked at her for a long time without saying anything. The morning light was coming through the gaps in the barn siding in long, thin lines, and the cattle in the near pasture were beginning their usual morning noise, and somewhere outside one of the horses was stamping impatiently, and Mamie Slater stood in the middle of all of it and waited for him to say whatever it was he was going to say. "That's a remarkable thing," he said at last, and he said it simply, with no performance in it, the way he said everything. "It's just what needed doing," she said, and she picked up her ledger and walked out of the barn to start the day's work. But she thought about the way he had looked at her when he said it, and she could not quite put the thought down. He stayed through November. He worked. He worked the way experienced range hands work, which is to say he did not need to be told things twice, and he saw what needed doing before it was pointed out to him, and he did it without complaint or display. He was good with cattle in the deep-bred way that comes from years of handling them, and he was good with horses in the natural way Cord was, and he was physically capable in the way of a man who had spent his entire adult life in physical labor, and had the kind of endurance that you either have or you don't. Pinto Davis watched Charles Warren for 2 weeks and then pronounced him sound, which from Pinto was essentially the highest compliment available. Mamie watched him too, though she was careful about it. She was 35 years old and she had been running this ranch alone for 6 years, and she had gotten into the habit of careful watchfulness as a survival mechanism, and she applied it to everything, including the particular way her attention kept finding Charles Warren in the course of a working day, and resting on him for a moment longer than strictly necessary. She told herself she was simply assessing a new hand, which was practical good sense. She told herself this several times over the course of a week before she admitted to herself that it was not entirely true. He had a way of being quiet that was different from most people's silence. Most people were quiet because they had nothing to say, or because they were uncomfortable, or because they were tired. Charles Warren was quiet in the way of someone who was genuinely at ease with silence, who had spent enough years alone on the range that silence was simply the texture of existence, and he was not disturbed by it. She found this quality in him deeply companionable, because she herself had become a woman who did not fill space with noise for its own sake. They ate the evening meal together, the whole outfit, at the long table she kept in the main kitchen, which had been James's tradition and which she had maintained because she believed it was good for the morale of the ranch, and also because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she was lonely enough that the company of her hands at supper was a thing she genuinely needed. Charles sat at the end of the table opposite her, not taking the head position but not relegating himself to the middle either, and he talked when there was conversation worth having and was quiet when there wasn't, and he listened to the others with a genuine attention that Mamie noticed and valued. One evening in late November, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and she was washing up the supper dishes, she heard his boots on the back porch and then his knock at the door. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood in the kitchen, turning his hat in his hands, and said, "I need to talk to you about something, Mrs. Slater, if you have a moment." "Sit down," she said, "and there's coffee still on the stove." He poured himself a cup and sat down at the kitchen table, and she dried her hands and sat across from him, and he looked at her with the direct, undemonstrative gaze he had and said, "I've been offered work in Wyoming Territory. A man I rode with years ago is building up a herd near Cheyenne, and he needs an experienced hand for the spring drive. It's good wages and steady work." She felt something tighten in her chest, and she was careful not to let it show in her face. "That sounds like a good opportunity," she said. "It is," he agreed. He looked at his coffee cup, "but I find I don't particularly want to take it." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove ticked softly. "Why is that?" she asked, and she made her voice very even. He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that she had seen building for weeks, something direct and honest and a little uncertain, which was the first uncertainty she had seen in him since he arrived. "Because I've been here 6 weeks and I've watched you run this place, and I've watched the way you care about it and the way you treat your people and the way you handle every problem that comes at you. And I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Slater, because I think you deserve honesty." He stopped and seemed to choose his next words with care. "I haven't wanted to be anywhere in years. I've been going from one place to the next, and I've been good at the work, and I haven't much cared about any of it. And then I rode onto this property, and I've cared about all of it." He paused. "About the ranch, and about you." Mamie Slater looked at Charles Warren across her kitchen table and felt the considerable weight of 6 years of managing everything alone shift slightly on her shoulders, not lifting, not disappearing, but shifting in the way a burden shifts when someone else puts a hand under part of it. "That's a direct thing to say," she said at last. "You're a direct woman," he said. "I thought you'd prefer it to something indirect." "I do prefer it," she said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands on the table. "I'll be equally direct with you, Mr. Warren. I've been alone for 6 years, and I've learned to be fine at it. I'm not looking for someone to take over what I've built or to tell me how to run it or to simply step into the space James left, because no one can do that, and I would not want them to try." She looked up at him. "But I've also been paying attention to you for 6 weeks, and I would not be honest if I told you I was unaffected by what I've seen." He nodded slowly, his expression attentive and careful. "You can stay through the winter if you want work," she said. "We'll see what spring brings." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he took his coffee cup and drank from it, and she thought she saw the very edges of something that might have been a smile. He stayed through the winter. Winter on the Texas Panhandle in 1884 was serious business. The cold came down from the north with the particular viciousness of plains weather, which does not moderate itself for human convenience. And there were 3 significant storms between December and February that required the whole outfit to work long, exhausting days in brutal cold, moving cattle to shelter and breaking ice from the water troughs, and keeping the hay supply moving to the animals that could not find grass through the frozen ground. Mamie worked the same hours her hands worked, and Charles worked beside her, and there were days when they didn't talk at all beyond the functional communication of people doing difficult work together, and there were evenings when they sat by the kitchen stove after supper with coffee and talked until the fire burned low. She learned him in those conversations, The way you learn someone when circumstances strip away the social performance that most people maintain and leave just the actual person underneath. He had grown up in Ohio and come west at 16 on the strength of ambition and restlessness, and a romantic idea about what the cattle country was that had been almost entirely wrong about the romance and exactly right about the work. He had never married, which surprised her less than it might have surprised someone who didn't know this particular kind of man, the kind that moves so constantly that commitment to a place or a person becomes functionally impossible. He had lost people. A partner on a drive in New Mexico to a rattlesnake bite in 1876. A good friend in a dispute over water rights in Arizona that had turned uglier than anyone anticipated. He talked about these losses with the contained grief of a man who had processed them as much as he was going to and was carrying the remainder without drama. She recognized this quality in him because she had it herself. He asked her about James, carefully, the way someone asks about a person they loved when they are talking to that person's widow, with a consideration for the grief that might still be living there. She talked about James honestly. She talked about who he had been, his energy and his humor and his extraordinary ability to believe things were going to work out even when the evidence strongly suggested otherwise. She talked about the grief, too, how it had been in the beginning, the particular hollowness of it, and how it had changed over 6 years into something different, less sharp, more like the ache of an old injury than the fresh pain of a new one. "I loved him," she said one evening in January, when the wind was loud against the windows and the kitchen was the warmest place in the world. "I will always be glad I loved him. But I've been a widow longer than I was a wife, and I've had to become someone capable of standing on my own, and that person, the one I've become, she doesn't need anyone to complete her." She looked at Charles steadily across the table. "But she might choose someone." "There's a difference," Charles nodded slowly. "I understand that difference," he said. "I'm not looking for someone to take care of me, Mrs. Slater. I've been taking care of myself for 24 years and I know how." He was quiet for a moment. "But there's a difference between being capable of being alone and it being the right condition." "No," she said, "there isn't always." "No," he agreed quietly. "Not always, but sometimes." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "You can call me Mamie. You've been here long enough." He smiled then fully, for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived, and it changed his face completely, took 10 years off it, revealed the younger man who was still inside the weathered one. "Thank you, Mamie," he said, and the way he said her name with that first unhurried use of it made something happen in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. February brought a storm that was worse than the ones before it. 3 days of driving snow and wind that kept everyone inside and pressed the cold down hard enough that 2 of her weakest animals died in the night despite everything they did. And on the 3rd day of the storm, with everyone confined to the buildings and the hands settled in the bunkhouse playing cards, Charles came to the main house with firewood because he had noticed from the bunkhouse window that her woodpile on the porch was getting low. She met him at the door and he came in with his arms full of wood and his coat thick with snow, and she took the wood from him and stacked it by the stove while he stomped the snow from his boots, and then they stood in her kitchen and looked at each other and she said, "Thank you," and he said, "Of course," and neither of them moved for a long moment that stretched out into something quite different from ordinary time. "I should get back," he said, but he did not move. "The storm is bad," she said, which was not what she meant to say but was perfectly true. "Yes," he said, also perfectly true. She reached up and brushed a clump of snow from the shoulder of his coat, a small automatic gesture, and his hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his shoulder, and she looked up at him and the distance between them was very small. "Mamie," he said, her name, just her name, with everything in it. "Don't," she said, not pulling her hand away. "Say something that changes things unless you mean it absolutely." "I mean it absolutely," he said, quietly and without any performance at all. She let him kiss her, and she kissed him back, and the storm howled against the windows of the ranch house, and the fire crackled in the stove, And it was the first time in 6 years that Mamie Slater had felt anything other than alone in her own kitchen. When he pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression that was serious and hopeful and a little bit wondering, and she put her hand flat against his chest for a moment and felt his heart beating, and then she stepped back and said, "I'll make coffee," because she needed a moment to simply breathe. And he said, "Yes," and took off his coat, and they sat down at the kitchen table, and the storm kept going outside, and they talked until almost midnight. March came in cold and went out warm, the way March in Texas does when it's feeling cooperative, and the grass came back and the calving season began in earnest, and the double W was suddenly in the full urgent chaos of spring, with new calves being born at all hours, and the branding fire going for days, and everyone working harder than they had all winter. Mamie ran the branding herself, the way she had run it every spring since 1879. She heated the double W iron in the fire and pressed it to each new calf's flank with the practiced certainty of someone who had done this enough times to have made it an art. And Charles worked beside her, holding the calves and reading the count. And when the last calf of that first week was branded and released, bawling, back to its mother, he stood up from where he'd been crouching and looked at her across the smoke and the smell of the brand and said, "Mamie, I want to talk to you about something." She set the branding iron in the bucket of water and looked at him. "Then talk." He looked at her with great seriousness. "I've been on this ranch since October. I've been working it and watching it and being part of it, and I know what this place is. I know what you've built here, and I know what it cost you, and I know what it means." He paused. "I want to ask if I can stay, not as a hand, as a partner, in the ranch and in whatever else you'd have me for." The branding fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the pasture a cow called for her calf, and the calf answered. "Partnership in a ranch is a business proposition," she said carefully. "And what else you're describing is a different proposition. Are you asking me about both?" "I'm asking about both," he said steadily. "You understand that the double W is mine," she said. "That the brand is mine, that the land is mine, that the decisions are mine, and that I will not be signing over any portion of that to anyone as a condition of anything else." "I understand that completely," he said, "and I would not ask it." She looked at him for a long moment. The spring wind moved through the grass behind him, and the light was very clear and honest, the way it is in early spring on the Texas plain, showing everything as it is without embellishment. "Ask me properly then," she said. "Don't make me wonder what you mean." He took off his hat. He looked at her with those steady, weathered, honest eyes of his, and he said, "Mamie Slater, I have been a traveling man for most of my life, and I never expected to stop traveling. And then I came to this place and I met you, and I have not wanted to go anywhere since the first week. I love you. I love this ranch, and I love the woman who built it and kept it alive, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life here with you if you'll have me." Mamie Slater had heard proposals of marriage before. She had been proposed to by James Slater in a cotton field in Missouri when she was 22, somewhat to her surprise, and she had said yes in the immediate and certain way of someone who already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the question. This was different. This was standing in the middle of a cattle operation she had fought for and maintained for 6 years, being asked by a man she had watched and tested and come to trust over the course of 5 months, and the answer was different in its arrival, not sudden and bright but deep and sure, like water reached after a long drilling. "I'll have you," she said, "on the terms you've stated." He put his hat back on and crossed the distance between them and kissed her in the middle of the spring branding, with the fire still burning and the cattle making their noise around them. And Pinto Davis, who happened to be walking by toward the far pasture, stopped and looked and then turned himself carefully around and walked in a different direction entirely, and they heard him laughing quietly as he went. They were married in June of 1885 in the Methodist Church in Amarillo, a practical ceremony attended by their hands and the Havorsons and Senor Bautista and Mrs. Calloway and a scattering of other people from the town who had watched Mamie Slater run the double W for 6 years and were, depending on their individual characters, either genuinely glad for her or fascinated by the proceedings. The preacher was a young man from Ohio who had been in Texas for 2 years and was still slightly astonished by it, and he conducted the service with a nervous enthusiasm that made everyone in the church feel a slightly protective warmth toward him. Charles wore a dark wool suit he had bought in Amarillo for the occasion, and it fit him reasonably well, and he stood at the front of the church with Pinto Davis beside him and watched Mamie come down the aisle in a dress that was a deep blue-green color, the color of the sky just before dark settles in, and his face was the face of a man who has received something far beyond what he expected to receive from life, and is not quite sure what to do with the size of the feeling. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful, but she was not 22 anymore, and her beauty was different from a young woman's beauty. It was the beauty of someone who had earned her face, who had been shaped by difficulty and decision and years of looking at hard country with clear eyes, and it was the most beautiful thing Charles Warren had ever seen in 40 years of looking at the world. The preacher said the words, and they said their own words back in Cord Maddox, who was apparently a man of deep and previously unsuspected feeling, cried quietly in the second row, and Tommy Birch, who was now 23 and fully grown into himself, sat beside Cord and stared straight ahead with the determined expression of a young man who was also moved, but had decided he was not going to be the second person to cry. They went home to the Double W in the late afternoon, and the long golden evening light of June lay over the grassland, and the cattle were visible in the distance moving slowly in the way of contented cattle, and Mamie sat beside Charles on the wagon seat going home and felt the warmth of his arm against hers and thought about 6 years of being alone on this land, and wondered at the way life arranged itself into patterns you could not have predicted. "You're quiet," Charles said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked out at the land. "About how different this looks to me now than it did this morning," she said. "It's the same land, the same sky, the same cattle. But it looks different." He looked at the land too. "Better or worse?" "Better," she said simply. "It was already the most important thing in my life. Now it's something I'm sharing instead of something I'm defending, and that's different." He reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat. "You'll still defend it," he said. "And so will I know," she said. And she did know. The first summer of their marriage was one of the best summers the Double W had ever had, not because the conditions were dramatically different from previous years, but because the work was shared in a way that made everything go more efficiently and with considerably less strain. Charles took on the trail drive management, which had been one of Mamie's heavier burdens because it required her to either go herself, which she had done twice, or to manage it at a remove through Pinto, which always involved a margin of uncertainty. Charles knew trail drives the way he knew horses, from the inside out, and he took 60 head north to Dodge City in July and came back with the best price per head the Double W had ever achieved. And he came back with a story about a confrontation with a buyer who had tried to short count their animals, which story involved Charles standing very still and very quiet while the buyer reconsidered, which Mamie found she could picture perfectly. Galt Prentice, who had continued his practice of offering low prices to smaller operators, had made the mistake of approaching Charles in town one afternoon while Charles was loading supplies, and suggesting that the Double W might consider selling their autumn stock through Prentice's arrangement at what Prentice described as a preferential rate. Charles had listened to the entire proposition with the patient, attentive expression he used when he was deciding whether something deserved a response, and then had said very calmly that the Double W managed its own market arrangements and always had, and that if Prentice was looking for suppliers he might try approaching ranches that hadn't spent 6 years demonstrating they didn't need his help, and that Mamie Slater had been running that outfit since before Prentice had decided Texas was a good investment, and she would continue to do so without his assistance. Mamie heard this account from Mrs. Calloway, who had heard it from the man who ran the general store, who had been present, and she sat with Mrs. Calloway in the mercantile over tea and tried not to let her expression show too much of what she was feeling. "He said your name quite firmly," Mrs. Calloway reported. "The way a man says a name when he means it as a statement." "I heard," Mamie said, and she drank her tea and looked out the window at the main street of Amarillo and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. In the fall of 1885, something happened that became one of those stories a ranch keeps in its history, the way a family keeps a particular photograph, handling it with care and bringing it out when it matters. A late-season storm came through the Panhandle in November, unexpected and severe, moving faster than the sky had suggested it would, and it caught a large portion of the Double W herd in the far south pasture, nearly 4 miles from the main buildings, before anyone realized how bad it was going to be. Charles was already out there, had ridden south that morning to check fence line, and Mamie was in the house when Pinto came in from the barn saying the sky was doing things that made him nervous. She went to the door and looked. The sky to the northwest was the color of iron, hard and flat and low, and it was moving with a speed that made her stomach drop. She called for Tommy and Cord and pulled her own coat and boots on and went for her horse, and she rode south with her 2 hands behind her, and the wind beginning to build across the grass in that particular howling way that means something serious is coming. They found Charles already working the herd, pushing them east toward lower ground where a limestone ridge would provide some shelter, working his horse through the cattle with the focused urgency of a man who understood the time he had. Mamie rode in from the west side without being told and began working the stragglers, and Pinto and Tommy and Cord spread out and they moved the herd, all of them together, in the gathering dark of the storm, with the wind getting loud enough to make talking impossible. They got the herd to the ridge. They counted heads as best they could in the chaos and accounted for nearly all of them. They rode out the worst of the storm on the lee side of the limestone formation, pressed against the rock with the cattle milling around them, and Charles pulled Mamie against him when the hail started coming sideways and put himself between her and the worst of it, which she allowed because it was practical and also because she wanted to, and those 2 reasons together were sufficient. They lost 4 animals. Given the speed and severity of that storm, 4 was a number that the Havorsons and Senor Bautista and every other rancher in the area would later agree was practically a miracle. They rode home in the dark, wet and cold and exhausted, and Mamie made a fire and Tommy and Cord and Pinto went to the bunkhouse, and she and Charles sat by the fire, and he looked at her with something in his face that was more than the evening's exertion. "What are you thinking?" she asked him, the way she had learned to ask him things directly. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I came here because James Slater told me years ago, over a fire not much different from this one, that he was going to get land and raise cattle and make something that lasted. And I'm thinking that what lasted is not exactly what he thought it would be, but it's something better." He looked at her. "It's you, Mamie. You are what lasted, not the land and not the cattle, though those are here too. You are what he built that was worth the building." She looked at the fire for a long moment and then she said, "James would have liked you." "I know," Charles said simply and without arrogance. "We liked each other. That's why I came looking." She reached over and took his hand and they sat together by the fire while the wind went on outside and the cattle settled and the ranch went quiet around them. And that was one of those evenings that you keep inside yourself for the rest of your life like a warm stone in a pocket. The winter of 1885 was a good one. Not easy, because winter on the Panhandle was never easy, but good in the way a hard thing is good when you're doing it well and with the right person beside you. They worked and they rested and they talked and they learned each other's habits and edges, and there were disagreements, because 2 people who have both been entirely self-reliant for a long time and who both have strong opinions about cattle management are inevitably going to disagree about cattle management, and they did. The first real argument was about the new fencing, The territory was changing. The open-range era was shifting as more ranchers ran barbed wire, and the old common grazing lands began to divide and close. And Charles thought they needed to expand their fencing on the western boundary before their neighbor in that direction got there first. And Mamie thought the capital would be better spent on improving the herd quality with another good breeding bull. They argued about it at the kitchen table for 2 evenings in a row, both of them laying out their reasoning with the controlled intensity of people who knew what they were talking about and knew the stakes were real. On the 3rd evening, they reached a compromise. They would do both in sequence, the bull first because the calf crop was more immediately valuable, and then the western fencing in the spring before the grass came up, and the neighboring operations started pushing their cattle toward what was currently an informal boundary. The compromise was satisfying to both of them in the way compromises are when you both genuinely engage with the other person's reasoning and end up somewhere neither of you started. It was also, Mamie thought, one of the most useful things about having Charles here. He made her think harder about her decisions because she had to articulate them to someone who would push back intelligently, and her decisions were better for it. In the spring of 1886, Mamie discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge alone for 2 days before she told Charles, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted those 2 days to simply know it herself, to turn it over in her mind in the privacy of her own thoughts. She was 36 years old, which was not young for a first pregnancy in 1886, and she was honest with herself about what that meant and what it didn't mean, and she thought about it with the clear-eyed practicality that she brought to every significant thing in her life. And then she went and found Charles in the barn on a Tuesday morning and told him. He was in the middle of examining the hoof of one of the mares, and he set the horse's foot down carefully and straightened up and looked at her, and she watched the information travel across his face in the sequence that it took, first the comprehension, then the weight of what it meant, then something that cracked through his usually controlled expression like sunlight through clouds, pure and unguarded and overwhelmingly glad. "Mamie," he said. "Yes," she said. He crossed the barn in 3 strides and put his arms around her with the careful strength of someone holding something extremely precious, and she put her face against his chest and listened to his heart doing that quick, urgent thing it was doing, and she felt him press his mouth to the top of her head, and she thought that this was what she had not known she was going to have, this particular feeling, and that it was worth every single thing. The pregnancy was not entirely easy. She was tired in ways she had not been tired before, and there were weeks in the high summer when the heat made everything harder, and she had to give up some of the more physical work, which cost her something because she was not a woman who enjoyed giving things up. Charles managed this with a sensitivity she appreciated, never making a production of the accommodations, simply rearranging the work distribution so that things got done without anyone drawing attention to the reason for the rearrangement. The hands were careful with her too. Pinto, who had known her since before James died and had watched her become everything she had become, was quietly and completely devoted in his steady, practical way. Tommy and Cord did the same. The double W closed around her pregnancy the way a ranch family closes around its own. Their son was born in December of 1886, in the ranch house, with a midwife from town named Mrs. Reyes, who had presided over more births in Randall County than anyone could count, and who had a calm, authoritative manner that Mamie found deeply reassuring. Charles was in the hall outside the bedroom for the better part of 12 hours, and Pinto was in the kitchen keeping coffee on and the fire built up, and Tommy fell asleep in his chair at about 3 in the morning, and Cord sat awake watching the door with an expression of focused concern. When the baby cried for the first time, the sound went through the ranch house and reached all of them at once, and Mrs. Reyes came to the door and told Charles he could come in. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Mamie in the bed holding their son, and the expression on his face was one that she would carry for the rest of her life and take out to look at on occasions when she needed it. It was not something she could have described precisely. It was the face of a man who had spent 40 years believing that certain things were not available to him and had just found out he was wrong. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with both large weathered hands and looked at him with absolute attention, cataloging him the way you catalog something irreplaceable. And the baby, who was red-faced and unimpressed with the world so far, made a small decisive sound and gripped one of Charles's fingers. "What will you name him?" Mrs. Reyes asked from the doorway. Mamie looked at Charles. Charles looked at her. "James," he said, asking the question with the name, and she looked at their son and nodded. "James Warren," she said. "James Charles Warren." Charles looked at her over the baby's head with that expression she loved, the one that was too large for his face to entirely contain, and he said quietly, "Thank you," and she reached out and put her hand against his jaw and said, "He should know who we came from." Young James Warren was a vigorous and demanding infant who developed opinions about the arrangement of his universe at a very early age, and expressed them loudly and without diplomacy, which Mamie found she could not be upset about because it was too familiar. He was dark-haired like his father and clear-eyed like his mother, and he grew with the determined enthusiasm of a child who has decided that the world is an interesting place and means to investigate all of it. 1887 was a rebuilding year in the best sense. Charles and Mamie managed the Double W together as true partners, making decisions jointly and dividing the labor according to what each did best, which worked because they were honest with each other about what each did best and didn't let pride complicate the allocation. She had a better instinct for the financial side and for the cattle breeding decisions. He had more experience with the drive logistics and the range management. They overlapped on everything else and argued productively when they did. The herd grew to 280 head by the summer of 1887, the largest the Double W had ever been. The land was fully fenced now. The western boundary secured the previous spring the way they'd agreed it needed to be. The debt was paid in full. Mamie Slater, who had stood at the Citizens Bank of Amarillo in 1878 and done arithmetic on the edge of despair, walked into that bank in the spring of 1887 and made the last payment on the land debt, and walked out into the April sunshine holding the receipt. And she stood on the main street of Amarillo for a moment with the receipt in her hand and looked at the sky and felt something so large she couldn't find a word for it. Charles was waiting with the wagon outside, and he saw her face when she came down the bank steps, and he got down from the wagon and she handed him the receipt without saying anything. And he looked at it and looked at her, and then he picked her up, right there on the main street of Amarillo in plain sight of everyone, and held her off the ground for a moment, and she laughed, which was not a sound she made carelessly. Mrs. Calloway, watching from the window of the mercantile, told everyone she knew about that moment with the selective glee of a woman who has waited 6 years for good things to happen to a person who deserved them. The spring of 1888 arrived with news that changed things. Galt Prentice, whose consolidation of the county's cattle market had been a thorn in every small operator's side for years, had extended himself too far in buying up a large piece of property to the north, and had found himself in financial difficulty when the Eastern financing he was depending on withdrew during a banking contraction. The word in town was that Prentice might have to liquidate some of his holdings. Charles heard this in town and came home and sat across the kitchen table from Mamie and laid it out for her. And they looked at each other, and then they looked at the map of the Double W and its surroundings that hung on the kitchen wall. "The northeast section he bought 3 years ago," Mamie said. "I know," Charles said. "It adjoins our property." "I know." She looked at the map for a long time. "It's good grazing land. The creek that runs through it would double our water access." "I know," Charles said again, and there was something in the way he said it that made her look at him and laugh. "Stop saying 'I know,'" she said. "I know," he said, with a small, completely deliberate smile, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they looked at the map together. They made an offer on the northeast section of what had been Prentice's holdings. They were not the only party interested, because good land in the Panhandle was always of interest, but they were prepared with real money and a clean reputation at the bank, and a relationship with the county that reflected 6 years of Mamie Slater paying her bills on time and handling her business honestly. The deal went through in the early summer of 1888, and the Double W grew by 320 acres. Charles rode the new boundary with Mamie on a long June afternoon, the two of them moving east from the creek through the new grass, and she watched the way he looked at the land with a proprietary satisfaction that she understood completely, because she had always felt it for this land, and now felt it for this addition. The creek ran clear and fast over pale limestone, and the cottonwood trees along its banks were in full summer leaf, and the cattle they'd already moved to try the new grazing were scattered through the grass looking profoundly comfortable. James Slater should have seen this, Charles said. Mamie looked at the land and the creek and the cattle. He did, in a way, she said. He's in all of it. He named the brand and he picked the land and he made the connections that eventually brought you here. He did see it. Charles looked at her quietly. That's a generous way to think about it. It's the true way, she said. I don't waste generosity on untrue things. He leaned across from his horse and kissed her, which made his horse and her horse both briefly startled and required some management, and they sorted out the horses and rode on along the creek in the long June light. The years of 1889 and 1890 were years of a different kind of challenge. The cattlemen of Texas and the broader West were in the midst of significant change, as the open range era came to its real conclusion, and the era of fenced, deeded land became the standard. This affected the old relationships between ranchers and the long drives to Kansas, as the railroad came further south, and the nature of cattle marketing changed, and Mamie and Charles adapted the way they had adapted to everything, with careful attention and practical flexibility. They sold their cattle to the railroad depot at Amarillo, which was simpler and less lucrative per head than the Dodge City drives had been, but was also considerably less risky. No month-long drive with its attendant dangers and losses. They kept the herd quality high, which meant the price per head at the depot was consistently among the best in the county, because buyers at the depot were willing to pay more for well-maintained stock. In 1890, Mamie had a second pregnancy. She was 40 years old, and this was not a thing anyone regarded without some concern, including Mamie herself, who was not given to ignoring medical realities. Mrs. Rays, who had delivered James Warren, came out to see her twice during the summer and autumn, and maintained a watchful attention that Mamie appreciated. Charles was attentive in the careful particular way he always was about things he cared about most, which is to say he was not hovering or demonstrative about his concern, but he was simply always exactly where he needed to be, and the quality of his attention was palpable. Their daughter arrived in November of 1890, small but loud, with a set of opinions that she began expressing immediately and showed no sign of moderating. They named her Ruth, for no reason they could entirely articulate except that when Charles said the name and Mamie heard it applied to the small, red-faced, furious person in her arms, it was clearly right. Ruth Warren grew up on the Double W with the certainty of someone born into a place that had been claimed and fought for and held, and she had her mother's clarity of eye and her father's steadiness, and the combined stubbornness of both of them at once, which Pinto Davis, who was still with the ranch and was now something between a foreman and a fixture, said was either going to make her the finest rancher in Texas or the most exasperating person he had ever known. And he said this with a pride that suggested he considered both outcomes acceptable. James, at 4, took to his baby sister with the immediate possessive devotion of a firstborn child, who has decided that the new arrival is his personal property and responsibility, and he appointed himself her guide to the ranch with a seriousness that was both funny and deeply touching. Charles watched his son showing his daughter the horses with the careful instruction of a 4-year-old who knows about horses because he has been allowed to be with them from the beginning. And something in Charles's face during these moments was so quietly complete that Mamie, watching from the doorway of the barn, felt the size of it in her own chest. One evening in the winter of 1891, after the children were in bed and the fire was burning and the ranch was settled, Mamie sat beside Charles in the sitting room they had finally furnished properly, after years of the kitchen table being the center of all domestic life, and she said to him something she had been thinking about for a while. "Do you know what I remember most clearly from the morning I got the telegram about James?" she said. He looked at her, attentive and quiet. "What?" "That the cattle were calling," she said, "in the distance, and my first thought after reading it was that they would need feeding in the morning regardless of what the telegram said." She was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that a lot over the years. The way the cattle go on needing things regardless, it kept me going that first year, the sheer unavoidability of the cattle." "They still need feeding," Charles said, the corners of his mouth moving slightly. "They certainly do," she agreed, "but it's different now. Now it's not keeping me going. Now it's just the thing we do." She looked at him. "You understand the difference I mean?" "I do," he said. "The difference between surviving and living." "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He reached over and took her hand in both of his, the way he had on the wagon seat coming home from their wedding, and they sat by the fire in the house on the Double W Ranch with the cattle settled in the winter pasture, and the children sleeping, and the brand in the registry, and the land paid for, and the debt cleared, and the years of difficulty and perseverance settled into the foundation of something that was now simply the good life they were living. And Mamie Slater Warren thought that if she had to name the thing she had been building toward without knowing it, through all those years and all that work and all that solitude, it was this. Exactly this. She thought about something Charles had said to her one afternoon the previous autumn, standing out by the south pasture fence in a moment of unusual stillness. They had been watching the herd move through the late day light, the cattle slow and contented, and he had said quietly and almost to himself, "You know what the bravest thing is? It's not any of the dramatic things. It's the keeping going, the daily keeping going when you don't know how it ends." She had looked at him and said, "Is that what you've been thinking about?" And he had looked at her with that expression she loved and said, "I've been thinking about you, about what you did here alone for 6 years, about what it took, about the fact that you kept this brand alive and this land going and these cattle healthy without knowing whether any of it would matter in the end. That's bravery, Mamie. I've seen men charge into dangerous things and call it courage. That's not the same. What you did was the hardest kind." She had been quiet for a while, looking at the cattle. Then she had said, "It didn't feel brave. It felt necessary." "The necessary things always feel that way to the people doing them," he had said. "That's what makes them brave." Now, sitting by the fire in their sitting room in the winter of 1891, she turned the memory of that afternoon over in her mind and held it for a moment the way you hold a thing that matters to you, carefully and with gratitude. The spring of 1892 brought the kind of full-throated explosion of green that the Texas Panhandle produces after a wet winter, the grass coming in thick and high, and the creek in the northeast section running full, and the Double W herd of now 315 head moving through it with the satisfied abundance of animals that have what they need. Charles rode the fence lines with Tommy, who was 30 now and had been with the ranch for 11 years, and had grown into his capability so completely that he was less an employee than a trusted part of the operation. Pinto was 62 and doing lighter work but still present, still reading the sky and the cattle with the eye of a man who had spent 4 decades learning the language of ranching. The brand was in good shape. The land was in good shape. The family was in good shape. One afternoon that spring, Mamie rode out alone to the south pasture, which she still did sometimes, the riding alone, because she was still a woman who needed that particular solitude to think. She sat her horse on the rise above the pasture and looked at the cattle below her and the land running out to the horizon in every direction, and the sky doing its enormous Texas thing overhead, full of light and cloud, and the particular blue that doesn't exist anywhere else. She thought about the day she had come out here in October of 1878, 14 years ago, with the telegram in her pocket, and she thought about who she had been then and who she was now, and everything the distance between those 2 points contained. She thought about James, who had given her this land and this brand, and who was woven into every fence post and every registration document and every branded animal and the very name of the ranch. She missed him still, in the way you miss people who shaped you, not with the sharp ache of fresh grief, but with a kind of permanent tenderness, a recognition of a debt you can never repay but can honor. She thought about Charles riding the fence lines right now with Tommy, and the children at the ranch house with Pinto, and the fact that by some complicated and unpredictable route she had arrived at a life that contained more than she had known to ask for. She turned her horse back toward home. The supper that evening was as it always was, the whole outfit at the long table, James Warren dominating the conversation with a 7-year-old's absolute confidence that everything he had observed that day was of interest to everyone present. Ruth sitting in her chair with the compact authority of a child who knows she is loved, and uses that security as a platform for her considerable personality. Pinto eating his food and contributing dry observations to the conversation at the moments of his choosing. Tommy and Cord listening, and talking with the ease of people who had been part of this table for long enough that it was simply home. Charles sat at the end of the table opposite Mamie and caught her eye across the length of it, and she looked at him, and he looked at her with that expression, the one she had learned over 6 years of marriage to read as well as she read the sky, and what it said was, This is what I came here for. This is what I wanted when I didn't know what I wanted." She looked back at him with her own expression, which she knew from the rare occasions she'd seen it reflected was clear and certain and full of everything she was, and what it said was, I know exactly." After supper, Charles helped her wash the dishes, which was a habit they had developed without ever exactly deciding to, and James helped too in his 7-year-old way, which was more assistance in principle than in practice, and Ruth sat on the counter and supervised, which was more accurate to her actual contribution. When the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean, and the house had settled into its evening sounds, Charles came and stood in the doorway of the sitting room where Mamie was writing a letter to her sister in Missouri, the regular monthly letter that had documented 6 years of solitary struggle and 6 more years of shared building, and all the births and deaths and storms and recoveries and seasons of the double W. "I was thinking," he said, "about something I said to you last fall. About the bravest thing." She put down her pen and looked at him. He came and sat across from her, and he looked at her with the full attention he gave the things that mattered most to him, and he said, "When I came here 6 years ago, I was a man who had been going from place to place for so long that I'd stopped being able to tell the difference between moving and living. And I rode onto this ranch and I found you and everything you had built and kept alive. And I want you to know, Mamie, I think about that often. The 6 years before I came. What you did here alone." He was quiet for a moment. "You kept this brand alive when you could have sold. You kept this land when you could have let it go. You kept this herd when every year probably gave you reasons to quit. And you did it not for yourself but for something you believed in, for what James built and what this place was supposed to be." She looked at him steadily. "I did it for myself too," she said honestly. "I wanted the land, I wanted the cattle, I wanted to prove I could." "I know," he said. "That's part of what I mean. You wanted it enough to do the hard thing year after year, and you did it." He reached over and took her hand. "That's the bravest thing I have ever seen," he said simply. "In 46 years of looking at the world, and I have seen some things worth looking at, that is the bravest." Mamie Slater Warren looked at her husband across the small table in the sitting room of the ranch house on the Double W. In the winter of 1891, with the fire warm and the children sleeping and the cattle settled, and the brand in the registry and the land paid for, and the years of all of it laid out behind them like a trail they had come along, and she felt the full weight of what he was saying, not only the compliment but the recognition, the being truly seen by someone who understood the cost of the thing they were seeing. She thought about the morning of the telegram, and the years of keeping the lists and the fence dispute, and the cold winters and the storms and the drought and the market prices and the branding fires and all of it, the long, ordinary, extraordinary years of keeping the Double W alive. She looked at Charles Warren, who had ridden onto her land as a stranger and become the truest partner she had ever had, and she said, "It was easier after you came." He squeezed her hand. "Good," he said. "That's what I came for." She turned his hand over and looked at it, the large, weathered, capable hand of a man who had spent 30 years working honest work, and she held it in both of hers and felt the particular rightness of it, the way it was simply and completely where it was supposed to be. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the winter grass, and the cattle were quiet in the dark pasture, and the creek ran along the new eastern boundary with its sound of ordinary permanence, and the Double W brand was registered in the county records under the name Mamie Slater Warren, and the sign at the ranch gate showed two overlapping W shapes pressed into the wood, and it had been there since 1872, and it would be there for a long time yet. And in the spring, there would be new calves with it pressed fresh into their flanks, and the hands would be there, and the children would be there watching and beginning to learn, and James Warren would stand beside his father at the branding fire, asking questions, and Ruth Warren would sit on the fence watching with that sharp, clear eye she had, and the ranch would go on. It would all go on. This was what it was to have built something. Not to have arrived somewhere and found it waiting, but to have made it yourself, season by season and year by year, through every kind of difficulty the land and the market and the weather and the loneliness could throw at you, and to have made it not just surviving but full, genuinely full, the way a good life is full when you have been honest about what you are doing and brave enough to do it. The fire burned low and the wind went on outside, and Charles Warren sat across from his wife in the house they had made on the land she had held, and Mamie Slater Warren looked at the fire and at his face, and at the letter to her sister half written on the table, and she thought she knew what to write in the letter this month. She would tell her sister that the ranch was the best it had ever been, that the herd was strong and the land was paid for, and the children were growing up brave and clear-eyed on the good hard ground of the Texas Panhandle, that she had a partner she trusted with everything, which was not a small thing, which was in fact the largest thing she had found outside of the land itself, that she had not expected any of this, the second love, the children, the expansion, the genuine shared prosperity, but that she had not stopped working either, which she thought was part of why it came. She would tell her sister that the Double W brand was alive and thriving, and that she had put it there in the ground, and kept it there herself when she needed to and shared the keeping of it now, and that both of those things, the alone keeping and the together keeping, had been the right thing in their time. She would tell her sister that she was happy. That was the whole of it, finally and completely. She was happy in the full, grounded, eyes-open way of someone who had been through enough to know what happiness actually is, which is not the absence of difficulty but the presence of meaning, the sense that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing, with exactly the right person beside you. The Double W brand would go on for another generation after them. Young James Warren would grow into the rancher his father and mother had always seen the promise of, taking to the cattle work with James Slater's passionate conviction, and Charles Warren's steady capability, and his mother's clear financial mind, a combination that made him one of the finest operators in the Panhandle by the time he was in his 30s. Ruth Warren would marry a rancher from the eastern part of the territory and start her own operation, and she would run it with a precision and a stubbornness that everyone who knew her parents recognized immediately. Pinto Davis would work the Double W until he was 69 and retire to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, where he and the old widow became, over the course of several years, inseparable companions in that quiet, careful way of people who come to care for each other late in life and are grateful for every day of it. Tommy Birch would buy a small piece of land to the west and start his own operation in 1895, and Mamie and Charles would help him with it in the way that ranching communities help their own, with advice and the loan of equipment and the kind of practical generosity that costs you something real and is given freely anyway. All of that was coming, growing in the ground like the spring grass, waiting for the season. But in this moment, in the winter sitting room of the Double W, none of that had happened yet, and none of it needed to. What there was the fire and the quiet and the two of them, and the ranch settled around them, and the long, improbable, beautiful story of how they had come to be here, which had started with a telegram and a widow standing on a porch, and a decision not to let something good disappear from the world. Charles looked at Mamie across the table, and she looked at him, and there was nothing that needed to be said that had not been said, and nothing that needed to be done that was not already done, and the Double W brand was alive in the world and in the registry, and on the flanks of 300 cattle sleeping in the winter pasture, and it would be alive tomorrow and the day after and for all the seasons to come. This is what it is, she thought. This is what it was always going to be if you kept going long enough to get here. She picked up her pen and began writing the letter to her sister. Outside, the wind moved through the grass of the Texas Panhandle, and the stars over the Double W were extraordinary, the way stars are when there is nothing between you and them but the clean, cold air of the high plain, thick and bright and endlessly patient, the same stars that had been there for every year of the keeping and the building and the loving, watching all of it with the long, impartial witness of the sky.